History has given us many causes of the American Civil War. However, the soldiers, North and South, who fought it, had powerful personal reasons for leaving home and family. In general, Northerners believed in the Federal Union above all. Southerners felt a stronger allegiance to their home states. Long before fighting began, many widespread problems had become polarized. One of the most divisive was slavery. This subject had both moral and economic aspects, and its core issue was the ownership of blacks by whites. In the agricultural South, with its vast plantations, slaves were considered essential for raising cotton, the principal crop. In the more industrialized North, farms were smaller, cheap labor was abundant, and slavery was unnecessary. Powerful moral issues were involved. In addition to the barbaric pens in which blacks were often held before being sold, there was the degradation of the auction block itself. Black families were often divided because the demand was for younger, stronger workers. Businesses as close to the nation's capital as Alexandria, Virginia, were devoted to the selling of slaves. In the North, an articulate group of prominent figures, including publisher William Lloyd Garrison and poet John Greenleaf Whittier, spoke for the abolitionist movement, dedicated to ending slavery. One human being, they believed, could not own another. Among the movement's most persuasive members was eloquent Frederick Douglass, a self-taught runaway slave. John Brown was an abolitionist of an utterly different kind. He was a violent man who believed that only violence and bloodshed could end slavery. In October 1859 at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, he and a small band of followers attacked the United States Armory. His aim was to seize arms and equip the slaves he expected to rise up and join him. But his raid was a disaster. Some of his men were killed, and there was no uprising. The insurgents were trapped and captured in the armory by United States Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant Jeb Stuart. Brown and the other survivors were tried, convicted of treason, and hanged. His life was a failure, but after his death, many abolitionists considered John Brown a martyr. In November of the next year, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He was a strong man, firmly committed to the Union. Southerners reacted with fury. For them, this meant that the federal government, not the individual states, would control the issues dividing the country, with slavery inevitably the overwhelming problem. To protect their Southern institutions and interests, there was for them no choice but to leave the Union. South Carolina seceded first in December 1860, and was soon followed by Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. Their initial intent was not to form a new nation, but if they had to fight to maintain their separation, there was no viable alternative. On February 4, 1861, delegates from the seceded states met at Montgomery, Alabama. They drafted a constitution, elected Jefferson Davis their president, and created the Confederate States of America. With volunteers now under arms, they began to seize federal property within their boundaries. Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated President of the United States on March 4, 1861. In his address, he spoke directly to the Southern states.
"In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors."
But it was too late for words, however splendid, reasonable, and sincere. Events that could not be stopped had begun weeks earlier, several hundred miles to the south. With the secession of South Carolina, federal military posts around Charleston Harbor were put in jeopardy. Only Fort Moultrie was manned by more than a few soldiers, Here, Major Robert Anderson commanded a garrison of 85 men. Moultrie was easily accessible, and Anderson saw that it could not be defended. Fort Sumpter, still incomplete, was built on an isolated shoal at the harbor entrance. Secretly, on December 26, 1860, Anderson transferred his men to Fort Sumpter. Charlestonians were outraged, and state volunteers occupied Fort Moultrie and built artillery batteries around the harbor. President James Buchanan sent an unarmed relief ship, the Star of the West, with provisions and reinforcements for Sumpter. State shore batteries fired on her and drove her off. Events at beleaguered Fort Sumpter changed dramatically with the inauguration of President Lincoln in the north and President Davis at Montgomery. Confederate General Pierre G.T. Beauregard took command at Charleston. On April 11, 1861, he demanded Fort Sumter's surrender. Although the Federal garrison was nearly out of supplies, Anderson refused. Early in the morning of April 12th, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumpter. The men at Sumpter had been ordered to the first-tier gun rooms. However, Sergeant John Carmody defied orders, went up to the parapet, and fired by himself one loaded cannon after another. Some of the townspeople went wild with excitement. At last, they were striking back against the hated Yankees. Others, frightened by the thunder of the guns, may have wondered what further horrors now lay ahead. Shells burst inside Fort Sumpter through the night and into a second day. Fires neared the powder magazine. That evening, April 13, 1861, Major Anderson surrendered the fort. Civil war, so long dreaded by some, welcomed by others, had begun. The capture of Fort Sumpter stunned both North and South. In New York City, the news drew a gigantic rally, packing Union Square, demanding retaliation. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion and ordered a blockade of southern ports. He began plans to protect Washington and to invade the South. President Davis in Montgomery ordered 100,000 more volunteers. Virginia seceded in view of Lincoln's clear plan to march Northern soldiers through her territory to attack other Southern states. Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina soon followed. The Confederacy had taken shape. But Montgomery was too remote. The new nation's capital was moved to Richmond, Virginia, the likely area of the first Northern attack. Southern pride and patriotism rose to powerful heights. Enlistment offices and training camps were mobbed. Union men flocked to their colors as well, and the cry, "On to Richmond," echoed throughout the North. Overwhelmingly, the federal purpose was to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. Eager Confederate forces were assembled near Manassas, Virginia, on a route from Washington to Richmond. The fever of war gripped both sides, and many practical issues were ignored. North and South, officers and men alike, were amateurs. No one had combat experience on the scale indicated by the size of the forces shaping up. Yet the nations plunged ahead all but blindly, each driven by a fiery belief in the righteousness of its cause. It was clear early that Virginia's lovely fields and woods were to become a major theater of battle. Only the Potomac lay between them and the federal capital, and there were several bridges. North and south, attention focused on Manassas Junction, 25 miles southwest of Washington. Two major railroads met here, both vital supply lines. One had connections to Richmond. Near the junction was a stream named Bull Run. General Beauregard, Confederate hero of Fort Sumpter, commanded the Southern forces. General Irvin McDowell, a former staff officer with little combat experience, led the Federal troops. Both armies were mostly raw recruits, whose heads were filled with dreams of heroism and glory in battle. Confederate reinforcements arrived in Manassas by train, among the earliest uses of railroads to move troops. Civilians swarmed out from Washington to view the spectacle of war. On July 21st, at the Stone Bridge over Bull Run, the first major engagement of the Civil War began. Fighting spread. The Confederates were driven back from Matthews Hill. A Southern officer spotted fresh troops under General Thomas J. Jackson holding firm on Henry Hill. "There stands Jackson like a stone wall," he shouted, and the Confederates rallied. Green soldiers on both sides discovered to their horror that war was blood and pain and death. After brutal fighting, the Federal forces were smashed. In the ensuing rout, sightseers and Union soldiers alike fled the carnage, rushing back wildly to the safety of the city of Washington. At first Manassas, Stonewall Jackson earned the name that would stay with him forever. The Confederates proved they were a strong and resolute foe, and both sides realized their notions of a short war were fast fading away. By now, the city of Washington had become an armed camp ringed by defensive forts. Federal soldiers were even bivouacked in the unfinished Capitol Rotunda. And this was only the beginning. The next month, 800 miles or so to the west, in Missouri, a battle was fought in the struggle to decide whether that state would be federal or Confederate. Union General Nathaniel Lyon had captured Missouri's capital, Jefferson City. He headed for Springfield and a superior Confederate force nearby at Wilson's Creek. On August 10, 1861, Lyon surprised and overran several Southern camps. Confederate artillery stopped the Federals, and Southern General Sterling Price was able to form a battle line. Fighting raged at close quarters for 5 hours. General Lyon, already wounded, was killed leading an attack, the first Union general to die in the war. The first major engagement in the West, as well as in the East, had gone to the Confederacy. In February 1862, Union General Samuel R. Curtis, with 10,000 men, chased Confederate General Sterling Price, whose force was half as large, out of Missouri and into northwest Arkansas. There Price joined another Confederate army under General Ben McCulloch. Now, very abruptly, Curtis and his Federals were outnumbered, and they dug in near Pea Ridge. Confederate General Earl Van Dorn took command of the combined Southern forces and attacked Curtis on March 7, 1862. Some Southern troops ran into heavy Federal fire. McCulloch was killed, and his men were scattered. Meanwhile, the balance of Van Dorn's Confederates attacked the enemy east of Pea Ridge, near Elkhorn Tavern. The Southerners steadily pushed the enemy back, and by nightfall, they had captured the tavern. Next day, March 8th, Curtis's Federals counterattacked near the tavern. After an artillery assault, Northern infantry drove the enemy from the field. The Confederates were running short of ammunition. Further resistance was impossible, and Van Dorn ordered his men to withdraw. The Battle of Pea Ridge ended, solidifying Federal control of Missouri. Early in 1862, attention was drawn to another area of the Western theater of war, specifically to northern Tennessee. Confederate Fort Henry, unfinished and poorly situated, was quickly pounded into submission by Union River gunboats. A few days later, and 12 miles east, at Confederate Fort Donaldson on the Cumberland River, the story was different. It was far stronger. There were 12 guns in the river batteries, and some of the Southern forces were housed in winter quarters behind solid earthen fortifications. Federal land forces at both forts were led by a comparatively obscure general named Ulysses S. Grant. He was about to begin his heroic rise to fame. The Battle of Fort Donaldson opened on February 14, 1862, when Union gunboats attacked the water batteries. The boats were driven off. On the 15th, fighting was intense as the fort's garrison tried to fight its way out. 2 of the Confederate commanders slipped away with 2,000 men. Others followed. General Simon Bolivar Buckner was left in command. He and Grant had been classmates at West Point. On February 16th, he asked Grant for terms. Grant's response was blunt.
"No terms except an immediate and unconditional surrender can be accepted."
The generals met in the Dover Hotel, and Buckner surrendered his army. The Confederate soldiers taken prisoner were rounded up and sent to a camp in the north. The fall of Fort Donaldson was the Union's first major victory of the Civil War. On March 9, 1862, naval history was made in Hampton Roads, Virginia. 2 unique and awkward vessels, the Monitor and the Merrimac, fought the first battle ever between ironclad warships. The Confederate Merrimac in that duel was originally the United States frigate Merrimac. After Virginia seceded, the Federals set fire to the Norfolk Navy Yard and abandoned it. The Merrimac burned to the waterline. The Confederates salvaged her and built a slanted superstructure of thick iron plates on her wooden hull. She carried 10 guns. She was renamed the Virginia, but is still popularly called the Merrimac. The Federal Monitor, on the other hand, was a warship of an entirely new design. Her deck of iron plates was awash. She was called a cheese box on a raft. The cheese box was a revolving circular turret with 2 11-inch guns. The Merrimac attacked the Federal fleet near Hampton Roads on March 8, 1862, hours before the Monitor appeared. She destroyed 2 Union warships and then moved away from the fleet at nightfall. The Monitor arrived, and on March 9th, the historic battle was fought at close range. The duel ended around noon. Little damage was done. The outcome was indecisive, and both sides claimed victory. But the Confederates were forced to destroy their Merrimac 2 months later to avoid capture. The Monitor was photographed several times, with her officers or crewmen posed proudly near the dents from the Merrimac's cannonballs. Other ironclads were built in several designs, and some patrolled the James River. There, the original Monitor got within 7 miles of Richmond, and as close as the Confederate fort on Drury's Bluff. But like the Merrimac, the Monitor too came to a sad end. On the last day of 1862, she sank in a gale off Cape Hatteras. 16 of her men died with her. These 2 immortal ironclads had proved in battle their vast superiority over wooden warships. After his capture of Fort Donaldson, General Grant next moved his army up the Tennessee River to Pittsburg Landing. The troops came by steamer. He was ordered to wait here for a second Federal army to join him. His forces included green recruits, and he drilled them. He took normal security measures, but decided not to fortify his position. However, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston's army was only 22 miles southeast at Corinth, Mississippi. He marched his men toward Grant. On April 6, 1862, Johnston took the Federals completely by surprise at Shiloh Church, 2 miles from the landing. In nearly 11 hours of intense fighting, the Confederates drove back both flanks of the Union Army. The Federal center was isolated, and over 2,200 Northerners were captured. General Johnston was wounded in the leg while directing a frontal attack against the peach orchard. The injuries seemed minor, he ignored it, but he collapsed and bled to death before medical help arrived. With heavy artillery, Grant formed his men into a stand above Pittsburg Landing. Union reinforcements arrived, and Federal gunboats on the river threw shells into the enemy's lines. The strengthened Union forces advanced, reclaiming the ground lost the day before. Hurt and dying men from both sides came to this place to drink and bathe their wounds. Later it was given the name Bloody Pond. In all, the Confederates lost over 10,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing. To avoid further losses and potential defeat, they withdrew back to Corinth. The Federals, exhausted and badly mauled, did not pursue them. The terrible slaughter at the Shiloh Meeting House had ended. Fort Pulaski guarded the river approaches to Savannah, Georgia. Soon after the state seceded, the Southerners seized the fort. Although construction had begun in 1829 and continued for 18 years, its armament was still incomplete, and it was not garrisoned. However, it was, quote, as strong as the Rocky Mountains. Before the end of 1861, the Federal blockade tightened and the Confederates abandoned nearby Tybee Island. This was the only place from which Pulaski could be taken. The Federals set up artillery on Tybee and opened fire on April 10, 1862. The Confederates were not concerned. The enemy guns were a mile away, over twice the effective range of ordinary heavy ordnance. But the Federal guns included still experimental rifled cannon. The barrels of these guns had spiral grooves that gave a spin to the shells, vastly increasing their accuracy, range, and penetrating power. In the second day of the bombardment, the southeast angle was breached. Explosive shells burst still nearer to the powder magazine, and the battered fort surrendered. At once, the victorious Union commander, General David Hunter, a zealous abolitionist, on his own authority, freed the slaves in the area. This was done 5 months before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Many black men were enlisted into the Federal Army, forming the 1st South Carolina Colored Regiment. The rapid reduction and capture of Fort Pulaski proved to the military world that masonry forts would have to be redesigned to withstand sustained fire from rifled artillery. The Union soldiers here settled into the routine of garrison life. The breach in the wall was repaired, but the fort was never attacked again. In 1864, a review was photographed on the parade ground. The men in the background, although standing still for the camera, are playing baseball. This is one of the earliest known photographs of the game. Following the Federal disaster at First Manassas, command of the Union forces around Washington was given to popular General George B. McClellan. He was soon appointed Commander-in-Chief. McClellan did brilliant work in organizing and training the demoralized Federals. In March 1862, he moved his vast Army of the Potomac and its supplies to the peninsula between the York and the James Rivers in Virginia, roughly 75 miles southeast of Richmond. This was the greatest amphibious operation of the time. McClellan set up huge mortars near Yorktown. The Confederates evacuated before all the guns could be fired. A rear guard action was fought at Williamsburg as the Southerners continued their retreat. Despite heavy rains, swollen streams, and unending mud, some of McClellan's men moved within 6 miles of Richmond. The Confederates attacked at 7 Pines, or Fair Oaks. They were repulsed. After Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston was wounded on the second day of battle, June 1, 1862, General Robert E. Lee was appointed by President Davis field commander of the Southern forces. Lee termed his command the Army of Northern Virginia. The two names are linked forever in American history. McClellan, a cautious man, was convinced that his vast Federal army before Richmond was outnumbered by Lee's forces. It was not, but it was outmaneuvered. On June 25, 1862, beginning with a series of 7 battles in as many days, McClellan gradually withdrew. An aggressive enemy pushed him and his vast train of supplies farther and farther from Richmond. Although McClellan wished to stay and fight, his army was recalled to Washington to support a new Federal offensive in northern Virginia. One of the war's most intriguing developments was practical observation balloons, inflated in the field and used to spy on enemy positions and movements. This one aided the Federals at the Battle of Fair Oaks. Meanwhile, Union forces in northern Virginia were organized under the command of Confident General John Pope. In late August 1862, Lee sent Stonewall Jackson's men on a 2-day, 50-mile march around Union lines, cutting off Pope from Washington. Jackson's famished soldiers seized Pope's supply depot at Manassas Junction. They gorged themselves and then burned everything that remained. Northern and Southern forces converged on Manassas, on nearly the same ground they'd fought over 13 months before. Part of McClellan's army, having just turned back from the gates of Richmond, increased Pope's strength. Jackson, knowing Lee would soon arrive with reinforcements, chose to attack and opened the Battle of Second Manassas. On August 29th, Jackson's men were posted along an unfinished railroad bridge. Pope launched his Union forces against them. The Southerners held firm. The next day, Pope mistakenly believed Lee and Jackson were retreating. They were not. Pope doggedly attacked again. Some Southerners ran out of ammunition and hurled rocks at the enemy. Pope again was repulsed. Lee counterattacked. Union forces made a heroic stand on Chin Ridge, but they could only delay the inevitable. Fighting swirled near the Stone House, which served as a field hospital in both battles at Manassas. Pope's Federal army faced destruction or retreat, and he chose the latter. After dark, the defeated Northerners struggled across Bull Run and on toward the defenses of Washington. Before the war began, it was felt that the newly enlarged wings of the national capital required a larger dome. Construction was underway at the time of Lincoln's inauguration. As the conflict lengthened, work continued on the dome. Lincoln's comment was perceptive.
If the people see the Capitol going on, it is a sign that we intend the Union shall go on.
After his success at Second Manassas, Lee determined to carry the war to Maryland. This was an adjacent border state with many Confederate sympathizers. He might secure much-needed recruits and supplies and briefly move the center of conflict away from Virginia. His army began crossing the Potomac into Maryland in sight of Federal pickets. McClellan's main forces followed, a few days behind. By September 15, 1862, near the town of Sharpsburg, both armies were still deploying. The Confederates were outnumbered at least 2-1. The two armies positioned on opposite sides of Antietam Creek, which was spanned by 3 bridges a few miles apart. The battle opened early on September 17th. McClellan's plan is unclear. One early scene of bloodshed was a cornfield. The field changed hands several times, and men of both sides were cut down in vast numbers. There was intense fighting around the Dunker Church, meeting place of a religious sect devoted to peace. Confederates were also posted along a sunken farm road. They were so relentlessly assaulted and suffered such appalling losses that the road was known forever afterward as Bloody Lane. The fighting here ended in confusion, exhaustion, and death. Union General Ambrose Burnside and his men were eventually able to force their way across one of the bridges over the creek. However, the Federals were later driven back to the stream. Despite Burnside's failure here, the bridge has been called by his name ever since. Before sundown of the same day, the Battle of Antietam had come to its agonizing end. The next night, General Lee began his withdrawal across the Potomac back into Virginia. The battle at Sharpsburg was a bloody stalemate, and the cost was horrible. Over 23,000 men were killed or wounded. The day of Antietam, September 17, 1862, was the bloodiest one-day battle in American history. Two weeks after the battle, Lincoln met McClellan at Antietam. He urged him to pursue Lee. McClellan again found excuses. Lincoln lost patience and removed him from command. However, the North had turned back Lee's invasion. This was the success Lincoln needed to give strength to his Emancipation Proclamation, issued 5 days after the battle. This document freed all slaves as of January 1, 1863, in the states in rebellion. This meant that as federal forces conquered seceded territory, slaves there were to be freed. Some of the ideals of Frederick Douglass and others were at last being realized. Black men had acted as cooks, servants, construction workers, and in other menial jobs since the war began. This arrangement freed white soldiers to fight. But Lincoln's proclamation provided for the enlistment of black men into the Union Army. For the first time, they were members of combat troops. Black units were exclusively black, under the command of white officers. They quickly proved their valor in battle, earning admiration from many, but by no means all of their white comrades in arms. Blacks had joined the Navy even earlier. At first, they and young whites as well were servants or ship's boys. But before long, they were regular sailors and fought with distinction. Black soldiers who were not members of a black regiment entirely from one state did not have the name of their state on their grave markers in national cemeteries. The inscription was USCT, United States Colored Troops. If this is less than ideal to modern eyes, it was a proud designation in the Civil War. Fredericksburg, Virginia is located halfway between Washington and Richmond. In late 1862, this was the scene of the next federal move against the Confederate capital. General Ambrose Burnside, whose heroic whiskers gave us the word sideburns, now commanded the Union Army. His opponent was Robert E. Lee. Burnside was blocked by the Rappahannock River. Weeks were wasted assembling bridge-building equipment. On December 11th, the Federals began the first of several bridges. Southern sharpshooters fired on them relentlessly. Burnside opened a bombardment of the city. Union soldiers poured across the bridges. Burnside ordered 2 attacks, the first against Stonewall Jackson on Prospect Hill. The Federals were driven back. Burnside's second assault against Lee's principal defenses on Marie's Heights was a disaster. Thousands of Union soldiers were slaughtered by artillery on the hill and by Confederate infantry behind a stone wall at the sunken road. The Southerners suffered relatively little loss. Chatham, a stately 18th-century home opposite the city, was a Federal hospital during the battle. Here, Clara Barton, later founder of the American Red Cross, tended the wounded. Thanks to Burnside, Lee achieved at Fredericksburg his most one-sided victory of the war. On the infamous Mud March several weeks later, Burnside led his men on another calamitous winter offensive. He was soon relieved of his command. By the autumn of 1862, Federal forces occupied the western half of Tennessee, including Nashville, the capital. 30 miles southeast, General Braxton Bragg's Confederate Army was in winter quarters astride placid Stones River near Murfreesboro. In late December, a Union army under General William S. Rosecrans marched south, planning to rout the Southerners and drive on Chattanooga. The Confederates seized the advantage and attacked on the last day of 1862. After early losses, the Federals finally stopped their enemy. The first day of battle at Stones River ended with both armies still in strong positions. There was little fighting on New Year's Day, but on January 2nd, 1863, some Federal forces that had forded the river were pushed back in vicious hand-to-hand fighting. The Confederates, however, ran into Union artillery fire from the heights above the ford and were driven back with great losses. They withdrew from Murfreesboro and Rosecrans claimed victory. The Battle of Stones River raised morale in the North, following Burnside's utter failure at Fredericksburg only 3 weeks earlier. Spring had come before war returned to the Fredericksburg area. The new Federal commander was called Fighting Joe Hooker. He spoke in extravagant terms.
May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none.
In late April 1863, much of Fredericksburg was in ruins, and most of Lee's army was spread in pockets outside the city. Hooker sent decoy units across the Rappahannock near the city to attack the Southerners. His main force, however, crossed the river far upstream and then turned directly back toward Lee. Federal strategy was to make a bold move to get behind the Confederates. Fighting broke out near Chancellorsville. Despite its name, this was only a crossroads with a large inn 10 miles west of Fredericksburg. Lee saw through Hooker's bluff and turned to face his enemy's main assault. Near the start of the battle on May 1st, Hooker became overcautious. His confidence collapsed. Generals Lee and Jackson conferred that night. Lee proposed to divide his army, less than half the size of Hooker's, sending Jackson's corps to circle around the Federal flank in a surprise attack. Lee would fight where he was. This was the last time the two Confederate leaders ever met. Next day, May 2nd, Jackson's column moved into position. Hooker assumed they were running away and let them go. Stonewall made a surprise attack and destroyed the Union flank. But that night, while reconnoitering, Jackson was accidentally wounded by his own men. On May 3rd, Hooker still held advantages despite the setbacks of the day before. He abandoned the benefits of Hazel Grove. Later that morning, he was stunned by debris from enemy cannon fire.
Fire!
The fiercest fighting at Chancellorsville took place near here, and the Confederates made the most of every opportunity. The battle was a major defeat for the Federal Army. The men in blue retreated across the Rappahannock, where they could recover in areas farther north. Lee had won a classic victory, and his strategy here is still studied by military professionals. But the triumph turned bitter. Surgeons found it necessary to amputate Stonewall Jackson's shattered left arm. He was taken to a remote farm building, contracted pneumonia, and died on May 10, 1863. Lee had lost his ablest lieutenant, and the South had lost a hero. Early in the war, both sides grasped the importance of the Mississippi River. If the South lost control of it, they would lose supplies and recruits from the West. The Confederates fortified vital river posts. Vicksburg was by far the most significant. Lincoln called it the key and said,
"The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket."
He ordered General Grant to destroy Southern resistance on the river. Grant's opponent was Confederate General John C. Pemberton, whose troops were scattered in Mississippi and Louisiana. In December 1862, the USS Cairo and other Union gunboats near Vicksburg were dispatched to clear mines, then called torpedoes, from nearby waters. A torpedo was an anchored container of powder fired by an electrical wire from shore. Unknowingly, the Cairo passed near two of them. She was the first vessel in history to be sunk by an electrically detonated torpedo. Grant realized that Vicksburg could only be attacked from the east. Relentlessly, he marched his army in a wide circular route around it, fighting at a number of key points. Grant's men, as their enemies slowly gave ground, reached the outskirts of Vicksburg itself. Here the Southerners had built a line of defense. The Federals took up parallel positions a few hundred yards away. On May 19, 1863, Grant attacked. He failed. He ordered a far larger assault 3 days later. There was desperate hand-to-hand fighting, but all Union forces were repulsed with devastating losses. On May 26th, Grant began a siege, a complete military and naval blockade of Vicksburg. The distance between the lines was short, and for protection, Federal soldiers dug shelters called shebangs in hillsides and trenches. Illinois Private Albert D.J. Cashier is seen at the right in this wartime photo. He had a solid combat record through Vicksburg to the war's end. 46 years later, after an accident, a doctor discovered his incredible secret. Cashier was a woman. Her gravestone calls her Jenny Hodges. She was also Private Albert D.J. Cashier, Company G, 95th Illinois Infantry. Fraternization between Union and Confederate soldiers was not uncommon, here and elsewhere during the war. Generally, Northern coffee was swapped for Southern tobacco. The Federals bombarded Vicksburg day and night. All supplies were cut off. Drinking water was polluted. Incessant shelling forced some civilians to live in caves. The siege continued for 47 terrible days. At last, with no hope of relief, General Pemberton asked Grant for terms. The two men agreed upon a surrender. Federal forces marched triumphantly into the city on July 4, 1863. Soon Port Hudson also surrendered, and the entire Mississippi River was in Federal control. In Lincoln's words,
"The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea."
General Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia invaded the North for the second time early in June 1863. He was heartened by his victory at Chancellorsville. Now another Confederate triumph would further discourage his enemy and might improve the chance of a negotiated peace. He crossed the Potomac to Maryland and continued on into Pennsylvania. Several scattered commands of the Army of the Potomac moved north to challenge him. Late in this crisis, on June 28th, General George G. Meade was given command of the Union Army preparing to confront General Lee. Only 2 days later, near the rural town of Gettysburg, men from the two armies met by chance before either Meade or Lee had arrived. The battle began the next day, July 1st, along McPherson's Ridge. Union Major General John F. Reynolds, a widely respected soldier, was killed in the fighting. He was the highest-ranking officer to die in the battle. John Burns, a civilian nearly 70 years of age, grabbed his ancient musket to fight beside the young men of the Union forces. He was wounded 3 times and became a Federal hero. By the afternoon of July 1st, units of the Federal Army attempted to hold off the Confederates. They were overpowered in heavy fighting and fell back to Cemetery Hill south of town. Here they dug in and built up their defenses. The larger part of Meade's army arrived during the night. The two commanders and most of their armies were present by the morning of July 2nd. The battle resumed in the afternoon. The Southerners took the offensive the entire day, as they had the day before. Bloody fighting raged in places that now bear famous names, such as the wheat field and the peach orchard. But the carnage was awful. In some sectors, the Federals were driven back. In others, they held on tenaciously. One of these was a small hill called Little Round Top. Federal General Gouverneur Warren noted its strategic importance and ordered troops to secure it. The Southerners attacked up the slope in vicious fighting. The Federals kept their grip. Confederate sharpshooters found cover in a nearby mass of boulders called Devil's Den. On the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee gambled on a major assault against the Union center. He hoped that Meade had weakened this part of his line in order to strengthen his flanks. Lee massed a force of some 12,000 men. Although the popular name is Pickett's Charge, its commander was General James Longstreet. His goal was the center of the Union line near a copse of trees. It was gallant beyond words, but in the face of Federal gunfire and bravery, the attack was doomed. Briefly, a few Confederates broke through the barrier of men in blue, but the charge ended in disaster. The Federals held. Only one Southerner and 2 returned safely to his own lines. Later, General Lee would say, "It's all my fault." The next day, July 4th, saw the retreat of Lee's army back to Virginia. Rain fell on the weary and battered Southerners. The wagon train bearing the wounded stretched 17 miles. Never again would Lee's army invade the North. Within days of taking command of the Army of the Potomac, General Meade had won the greatest battle ever fought in North America, one of the major turning points of the Civil War. In the North, with almost simultaneous victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, July 4th, 1863 was indeed a day for celebration. In November 1863, 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, President Abraham Lincoln came here to dedicate the National Cemetery. A huge crowd attended, most perhaps expecting a long, formal oration customary at the time. Lincoln, in a carefully composed speech, spoke briefly. He concluded with a passionate hope
that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Charleston, South Carolina, where the war began, was a special target of repeated Federal attacks. In mid-1863, an assault was planned on Fort Wagner at the entrance to the harbor, a mile and a half from Fort Sumpter. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment of Colored Troops was chosen to strike first. Their leader was Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Colonel Shaw came from a prominent Boston family of fervent abolitionists. In the evening of July 18, 1863, the men of the 54th opened the Federal attack. The Confederates proved to be far stronger than was thought, and Union losses were high. Colonel Shaw, at the head of his men, was killed as they reached the very top of the enemy works. The 54th suffered 25% casualties, and the Federal assault failed. But the United States colored troops had distinguished themselves in a close and desperate fight. The glory they earned at Fort Wagner inspired widespread enlistment by black men and greater acceptance by their white brothers in arms. The city of Chattanooga, in the extreme southeast corner of Tennessee, was a key rail hub and the gateway to the heart of the Confederacy. Following the indecisive Battle of Stones River, Northern General Rosecrans forced his opponent General Bragg back into the city. The Southerners dug in, but the Federals bypassed Chattanooga. In defense, Bragg was obliged to move southward too. He set up his forces along Chickamauga Creek across the state line in Georgia. On September 19, 1863, the opposing forces met near a mill on the creek. A general battle followed and continued the next day. The Confederates broke through a gap in the Federal lines and drove off Rosecrans and half his army. Northern General George H. Thomas took command of the remaining Federals and held his ground against repeated enemy assaults. His gallant stand allowed the defeated Union soldiers to withdraw into Chattanooga and earned Thomas his famous nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga. Bragg opened a siege and trained cannon on Chattanooga from the heights of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, overlooking the city and the Tennessee River. Vital Federal reinforcements were brought in, and in October 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant took overall command. On November 24th, aided by heavy fog, Union troops attacked the Southerners on Lookout Mountain. Here, the aptly named Battle Above the Clouds resulted in a Northern victory. The Confederates were also routed from their defenses at the Craven House below the summit. By the next day, Bragg had concentrated his Southern forces on Missionary Ridge east of the city. Their line was overwhelmed by the troops of Union General Thomas in one of the great charges of the war. The Southerners retreated into Georgia. The Federals now controlled Chattanooga. The city was available to General William Tecumseh Sherman as a base for his march on Atlanta the following spring. After Grant's solid series of victories at Fort Donaldson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, Lincoln brought him east and made him General-in-Chief of the Federal armies. In 2 words, the president best summed up Grant's military assets: he fights. The first of the classic encounters between Generals Grant and Lee took place on May 5th and 6th, 1864. The Battle of the Wilderness was fought roughly 15 miles west of Fredericksburg, Virginia. Grant intended to put his army between Lee and Richmond. The Confederates moved in, and fighting erupted over a wide area. But both sides became entangled in the dense undergrowth. The woods were tender dry. Gunfire ignited the brush and flames roared through the forest. Wounded men of both sides burned to death in the inferno. Tactically, the two-day battle was a draw. Grant broke the stalemate by moving his men south at night toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. Burning pine trees along the roadside lighted the route of march. Spotsylvania controlled the shortest route to Richmond. Lee's army arrived first and entrenched. On May 12th, in the rain and fog, Grant attacked. For 20 hours, the two armies were locked in the deadliest hand-to-hand combat of the entire war. This sector came to be called the Bloody Angle. The Southerners tenaciously defended their works. At last, on May 21st, the Federals abandoned the field. The Confederates continued to block the route to Richmond, but they had suffered irreplaceable losses. Of all the military prisons of the Civil War, Andersonville in southwestern Georgia was the most infamous. The first federal prisoners arrived in February 1864. At one period, over 32,000 men were confined in a pen designed for 10,000. It's taken for granted that soldiers in the field are given better care than prisoners of war. But at Andersonville, conditions became inhuman. The Confederate government could not provide food, clothing, shelter, or medical care. Through ignorance, drinking water was contaminated by the sinks or latrines. All told, nearly 13,000 died. Bodies were buried in trenches side by side, shoulder to shoulder. The original grave markers were of wood, as close together as the stockade logs. The war's most well-known military prison after Andersonville was Libby Prison in Richmond. Captured federal officers were confined here. Impossible living conditions existed in northern prisons as well. This is the camp at Elmira, New York. Southern prisoners suffered terrible privations. Here and at other camps, they were unused to northern winters and died in great numbers. After the war, when the horrors of Andersonville became known, revulsion swept the North. The camp's commandant, Captain Henry Wirtz, was arrested, tried as a war criminal, and condemned to death. On November 10, 1865, while eager spectators clung to nearby trees to watch, he was hanged in a prison courtyard in Washington, D.C. Today, most historians believe he was a scapegoat, a victim of the hysteria of the times. General Grant, as Union Commander-in-Chief, ordered a concerted offensive against the weakening Confederacy. By early May 1864, a federal army of 100,000 men under General William T. Sherman was ready at Chattanooga. Grant's orders to him were to break up the Confederate army in Georgia and to, quote, go into the enemy's country as far as you can, inflicting all the damage you can upon their war resources. Sherman set out toward Atlanta. Facing Sherman in the mountains of northwest Georgia was a Confederate army of 65,000 under General Joseph E. Johnston. He was an able commander, popular with his men, but he was outnumbered and undersupplied. Critics, including President Davis, accused him of timidity. Sherman confronted Johnston's forces with only two-thirds of his men. He sent the other third toward the railroad that was the Southerners' essential supply connection with Atlanta. With the Federals close behind, Johnston retreated to Resaca and dug in. Here the Confederates turned back Sherman's attacks. But the Union forces again threatened the railroad, and the Southerners withdrew. This same strategy was repeated several times through late May 1864 and into a period of endless rain in early June. The Federal Army moved steadily closer to Atlanta. With their line of supply constantly threatened, the Confederates retreated to the area of Kennesaw Mountain. only about 20 miles northwest of Georgia's capital. Here, Johnston had prepared entrenchments and artillery positions. Ironically, Sherman considered his attack on the mountain a diversionary strike, but in late June there was fierce fighting throughout the region. Federal attacks were brief and bloody failures. But Sherman continued his flanking tactics and was soon at the outskirts of Atlanta itself. Johnston abandoned Kennesaw on July 2nd and moved his army inside the fortifications of the capital city. President Davis, furious with Johnston at his repeated retreats, replaced him with General John Bell Hood. But Hood could do no better against Sherman's onslaught. At the Battle of Atlanta on July 22, 1864, Hood was driven back with great losses. Hood was defeated again within a week. Sherman put the city under siege, moving troops to seize the railroads. He cut the last one at the end of August. General Hood ordered the evacuation of Atlanta. He ordered all public property destroyed. Sherman entered the burning city on September 2nd. There were flames and ruin on all sides. The fall of Atlanta was a catastrophe for the South, crippling its ability to wage war and its will to resist. On November 8th, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected president in the North and vowed a fight to the finish. A week later, with Atlanta still in flames, Sherman set out on his devastating march to the sea. A military term for living off the land is foraging. Essentially, it means stealing supplies from the local citizens. But Sherman's army went far beyond foraging. Homes, farms, and crops were plundered and destroyed. Railroads were torn up, and in an operation used by both sides, the rails were piled on stacks of wooden ties, the timbers were set afire, and the red-hot rails were bent into useless shapes. These came to be called Sherman's neckties. Sherman's forces marched in parallel wings, and their path of destruction through Georgia was 50 to 60 miles wide in places. They reached Savannah on December 21, 1864. The terrible march to the sea had come to an end. In Virginia, the stalemate at Spotsylvania Courthouse deflected Grant from his direct push on Richmond. Dashing Jeb Stuart, Lee's trusted cavalry leader, had been killed. Federals and Confederates moved southeastward almost in parallel, with Lee's men a thin but firm wall shielding their capital city. Cold Harbor was a dusty crossroads about 8 miles from Richmond. There was no harbor anywhere near, and June 3, 1864 was a scorching summer day. Lee's forces entrenched. Grant ordered repeated attacks. The Federals suffered horrifying losses and gained nothing. In a post-war photograph, Union soldiers' remains are taken from field burials at Cold Harbor for reinterment in the National Cemetery here. No one, including Grant, could know now that Cold Harbor would be Lee's last major victory in the open field. Grant switched his tactics. He headed his army toward Petersburg, a critical rail junction 25 miles south of Richmond. The Federals attacked in the middle of June 1864. Confederate General Beauregard defended the city until Lee's Army of Northern Virginia joined him. Grant changed strategy again and began siege operations, which had worked well at Vicksburg. The siege guns used against Petersburg included a monster 17,000-pound mortar that lobbed 13-inch explosive shells into the Confederate defenses. It was named the Dictator. As at Vicksburg, the Federals planned a tunnel under the Confederate lines. It was over 500 feet long. They would set off a huge explosion, breach the Confederate lines, surge through the gap, and capture the city. 4 tons of powder were stacked in place. Union soldiers charged into and around the crater left by the explosion. The Confederates counterattacked, and the poorly trained Federals were trapped. The Battle of the Crater accomplished nothing for the North, and the siege of Petersburg continued for almost 10 more months. Grant's costly attacks had gained him 2 major railroads leading into the city. Also, he had turned a small seaport at City Point into a gigantic supply base for his army, one of the logistical triumphs of the war. By August 1864, he had captured a 3rd railroad, leaving Lee with 1 uncertain line and his worn-out wagons and teams. Winter, as usual, ended major actions, but the siege wore on, with continued shelling and scattered skirmishes. In early 1865, Lee's men, cold and starving, numbered 60,000. Grant commanded 110,000 fit and well-equipped troops. The Confederate defensive lines around Petersburg extended over 35 miles, and their lines were weak. Lee decided his last chance to break the Federal stranglehold on the city was to attack Grant at Fort Stedman, east of Petersburg. In fierce fighting, the Confederates were successful at first, but a massive Union counterattack drove them back. Lee now had few options left. On April 1, 1865, Grant sent General Philip Sheridan's forces against the junction of Five Forks, southwest of Petersburg. Sheridan wrecked the Confederate defenses. The next day, Grant ordered an all-out attack on the city. Southern soldiers at Fort Gregg waged an epic defense, but the Federals prevailed. Lee realized that the Army of Northern Virginia would soon be cut off. To save his men as a fighting force, he had to abandon Petersburg. With the loss of that city and its supply lines, the Confederate capital was doomed. Lee telegraphed President Davis that the government must leave at once. That same night, April 2nd, Lee and his men evacuated Petersburg. Federal forces moved in the next morning. Petersburg had fallen to the Union Army. One Federal soldier wrote later, "We knew that the beginning of the end had come." In Richmond, retreating Confederate soldiers set fire to military stores. Uncontrolled mobs spread the conflagration, and many citizens collected what little they could and fled from a city in flames. For the Confederate capital, the aftermath was dreadful. Although the stately Capitol building, designed by Thomas Jefferson, was spared, much of the city's financial and commercial district was ravaged and in ruins. In evacuating both Richmond and Petersburg, ragged Southern troops moved westward, roughly paralleling the Appomattox River. Lee hoped to link up his Army of Northern Virginia with other Confederate forces in North Carolina. South of the river, a vast blue flood of Federal soldiers moved westward as well, determined to isolate Lee's men. Union General George Armstrong Custer, active throughout the war, also fought prominently in this, its final campaign. During the first few days of April, the Confederates faced mounting odds. Expected supplies did not arrive. Foraging parties found nothing. In a running series of small engagements, the dwindling Southern forces were further reduced by capture and desertion. In Union General Phil Sheridan's words,
"If the thing is pressed, I think Lee will surrender."
Grant continued to block Lee's every attempt to move south. On April 6th, almost a third of the beleaguered Confederate troops were trapped and taken prisoner. 3 days later, all escape routes for Lee's army were cut off. The long, painful, bloody road had come to an end at the village of Appomattox Courthouse. This was a rural region devoted to farming. War had never come close. In 1861, a businessman named Wilmer McLean lived far away near Manassas Junction. During the war's first battle there, McLean's house became General Beauregard's headquarters. For business purposes, McLean moved his family here to the quiet village of Appomattox Courthouse. And here, on April 9, 1865, in one of the greatest ironies of American history, this house of Mr. McLean was chosen by the military as the place where General Lee would surrender to General Grant. Southern soldiers, exhausted, dispirited, and starving, could bear no more. Grant and Lee met in the front parlor of McLean's home to discuss terms. They chatted of old times and old friends in the Army before the war. This was a meeting of two noble Americans. Lee's courtly bearing in the face of defeat, Grant's kindness in offering the most generous surrender terms. He required only that the Confederates lay down their weapons. They were paroled on condition that they swear not to take up arms against the United States. That was all. This simple agreement on April 9, 1865, signaled the end of the war, the virtual end of the Confederacy. Other Southern armies in the field would also surrender in the coming weeks. At the end of the meeting with Lee, Grant gave orders for rations to be given to the hungry Confederates. Even before the official distribution began, many Federal troops were already sharing their coffee and bacon with the Southerners. Lee left the McLean house and rode back to the Confederate camp. His men, many in tears, reached out to touch his horse.
We still love you, General Lee.
The generals had one final meeting at Appomattox. Both expressed hope for reconciliation and peace. Then the two American soldiers separated. As with millions of Americans, the stress of war bore heavily on Lincoln. His rugged face in 1861 was infinitely younger than it was only 4 years later. The wounds of war appear in many forms. 5 days after Appomattox, President and Mrs. Lincoln, for relaxation, attended a popular comedy at Ford's Theater in Washington. Another couple were their guests. A woman in the audience noted,
"The president is in yonder upper right-hand private box, so handsomely decked with silken flags, festooned over a picture of George Washington."
John Wilkes Booth was an attractive, well-known actor, a dashing ladies' man. He was also a deranged Confederate sympathizer. He wasn't appearing in the play. He had a wholly different plot in mind. The comedy concerned a rustic American's ingenuity in outwitting his haughty English relatives. Booth probably knew which line would draw the biggest laugh.
"Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sock-dalogizing old man-trap."
Booth fired a bullet into Lincoln's brain. He jumped from the box, breaking a bone in his leg. He shouted the Latin motto of Virginia, meaning, "Thus always to tyrants," and limped off the stage. Somehow he made his escape on a horse he had waiting in a rear alley. The mortally wounded president was carried to a bedroom in the Peterson house opposite the theater. Doctors could do little. Mrs. Lincoln became hysterical and was led away. The president died in this room the next morning. Booth had set up a conspiracy to murder several Federal leaders. Hulking Lewis Payne wounded Secretary of State Seward on his sickbed, but did not kill him. The others failed in their tasks. The nearly crippled Booth was able to flee as far as central Virginia, where he was trapped in a barn. The building was set afire, and he was shot dead by himself or from outside. A military court tried 8 suspected conspirators. 4 were sentenced to be hanged, including Payne. The executions were carried out in the yard of the Washington prison. On May 23rd and 24th, 1865, Washington's public buildings still bore black crepe for the president's death. The Union Army staged a massive victory parade on Pennsylvania Avenue. One veteran wrote,
"I felt that day fully repaid me for all the hardships, dangers, and sufferings I had endured during all those years of strife and carnage."
The war was over. The guns were silent at last. Homes and farms and countrysides in the South were hopelessly ravaged. Blocks upon blocks of her proudest cities lay in ruins. The one leader who would have been her staunchest friend in the work of Reconstruction had been murdered, yet the country was whole again. The men of the Civil War are long gone now, but much remains, calling out to us about those 4 terrible years. We treasure the places where those men fought and suffered. We honor them with monuments. Best of all, we own a great collective American memory, a memory that will be with us forever.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.